The phone call that finally shattered the fragile peace of our new life didn't come from the police. It came from the elementary school secretary, her voice trembling with an uncomfortable, forced professionalism as she asked me to come down to the main office immediately. She wouldn't tell me over the phone what had happened, only that a social worker from Child Protective Services was currently sitting in a closed room with my 7-year-old daughter. I don't remember the drive to the school. I only remember the blinding terror that gripped my chest, a primal, suffocating panic that made the air in my lungs feel like crushed glass. When I burst through the double doors of the administrative office, I found Lily sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, her small legs dangling above the linoleum. Her face was buried in her hands, her narrow shoulders shaking with quiet, devastated sobs. When she looked up and saw me, those bright blue eyes, the exact same shade as her late mother's, were rimmed in red and overflowing with a profound, uncomprehending betrayal. She threw herself into my arms, burying her tear-soaked face in my neck, crying out, asking why the lady with the clipboard wanted to take her away from her daddy. Holding my little girl, feeling the frantic, bird-like beating of her heart against my ribs, the fear inside me crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable fury. I knew exactly who had made that call. I knew exactly who was trying to rip my family apart. To understand how we ended up in that nightmare, you have to go back to April, to the crisp, optimistic spring days, when Lily and I first unpacked our moving boxes in this sprawling, quiet suburban neighborhood. My wife had passed away from an aggressive cancer the previous autumn, leaving behind a house that felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life we could no longer touch. Everything in our old place, the smell of the floorboards, the angle of the morning light through the kitchen window, the height marks on the doorframe, screamed of her absence. I needed to breathe. Lily needed space to be a kid again, free from the heavy, suffocating blanket of our shared grief. So, we found a beautiful 2-story house with a sprawling, oak-shaded backyard, situated in a neighborhood renowned for its pristine parks and top-tier school district. It was supposed to be our sanctuary. It was supposed to be our fresh start. At first, the illusion held. The neighbors on our immediate left and right were aggressively cheerful, bringing over foil-wrapped banana bread and waving from their driveways as they watered their hydrangeas. It felt safe. It felt normal. But then we met Nancy. Nancy lived 2 houses down, a woman whose entire existence seemed meticulously curated, from her razor-sharp bob to the manicured perfection of her emerald lawn. The very first time she laid eyes on Lily and me, she stopped dead in her tracks. She was walking a small, fluffy terrier. And when Lily, bouncing with the innocent enthusiasm of a 7-year-old, ran up to the edge of the sidewalk to ask if she could pet the dog, Nancy reacted as if my daughter had just lunged at her with a weapon. She violently yanked the leash, pulling the poor animal behind her calves, her eyes darting frantically around the street. She looked down at Lily and demanded, in a voice dripping with sharp suspicion, to know where her parents were. I stepped forward immediately, my hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder, offering a polite smile. I introduced myself, casually mentioning that I was her father and that we had just moved in down the street. Nancy didn't smile back. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over my dark skin, my broad shoulders, and then darted to Lily, taking in her porcelain skin, her cascade of fine blonde hair, and those startlingly blue eyes. Nancy looked back at me, her lips curling into a tight, dismissive sneer. "Sure you are," she scoffed. I genuinely thought it was an awkward, poorly timed joke. I chuckled, waiting for the punchline, but her expression remained locked in a grim, hostile stare. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, dragging the terrier behind her. I brushed it off, telling myself she was just an eccentric, abrasive woman. I had no idea that brief, ugly encounter was the declaration of a war that would consume our lives for the next half-year. From that afternoon onward, Nancy transformed into a neighborhood sentinel, and my family was her sole target. I would be washing dishes at the kitchen sink and look out the window to see her standing dead center in her living room, her blinds pulled back just enough for her phone camera to poke through, snapping photos of Lily playing with her sidewalk chalk. When I walked Lily to the yellow school bus on the corner every morning, Nancy would conveniently emerge from her front door, trailing exactly 20 paces behind us, lingering at a communal mailbox for 10 solid minutes just to ensure she had eyes on us the entire time. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just harmless paranoia, the pathetic hobby of a bored suburbanite, but the whispers began shortly after. Lily had made a fast friend named Zoe, a sweet girl from across the street, and they had arranged a play date. The night before the girls were supposed to get together, Zoe's mother called me. She sounded mortified, her voice hushed and embarrassed. She confessed that Nancy had just spent 20 minutes on the phone with her, urgently warning her about the real story behind the dangerous black man who had somehow acquired a little white girl and moved into their pristine neighborhood. Nancy had explicitly told Zoe's mother that I was a threat, a predator masquerading as a grieving widower. I was livid. The next morning, I marched down the sidewalk and confronted Nancy while she was deadheading her roses. I kept my voice perfectly level, though my hands were shaking with suppressed rage, and I told her to stop poisoning the neighborhood with her vicious, racist fantasies. I pulled out my phone, aggressively scrolling to the hospital photos of me in scrubs, exhausted and crying with joy, holding a newborn Lily right next to my exhausted, radiant wife. Nancy barely glanced at the screen. She waved her gardening shears in the air dismissively, her eyes completely devoid of empathy. She told me that anybody with a computer could fake a photograph these days, and that she was merely doing her civic duty by keeping a watchful eye on a poor, helpless little girl who was clearly in a dangerous situation. 2 weeks later, the flashing lights arrived. I was sitting at my home office desk, deep into a spreadsheet, when the heavy, authoritative pounding on my front door rattled the window panes. I opened the door to find 3 uniformed police officers, hands resting casually but purposefully near their duty belts. They informed me, their tones clipped and serious, that they had received an urgent 911 call reporting a kidnapped child being held hostage at this address. The caller claimed to have witnessed a black man physically dragging a screaming white child into the residence. My vision swam. Lily wasn't even home. She was sitting in her second-grade math class. I spent the next hour handing over my driver's license, pulling the original, embossed birth certificate from my fireproof safe, and walking the officers through a house plastered with years of family portraits. The officers, eventually realizing the absurdity of the situation, offered tense, embarrassed apologies. They explained that they were legally obligated to investigate every report, no matter how dubious. I thought the humiliation of that afternoon would be the end of it. I was wrong. It was merely the prelude. Over the next 4 weeks, the police showed up at my house 4 more times. Every time I was seen in the front yard with Lily, every time we carried groceries in from the driveway, Nancy dialed 911. The local precinct quickly grew exasperated with her. The dispatchers knew her name. The patrol officers openly rolled their eyes when they stepped onto my porch. They even went to Nancy's house and officially warned her about the severe legal consequences of filing false police reports. But the threat of the law meant nothing to a woman convinced she was the righteous savior of her cul-de-sac. When the police stopped taking her seriously, Nancy escalated her crusade. That was how the CPS worker ended up pulling my daughter out of the middle of the school day, interrogating a grieving 7-year-old about whether the man she called dad was actually hurting her, buying her, or holding her captive. Driving home from the school that afternoon, with Lily exhausted and asleep in the passenger seat, the lingering guilt I had felt about engaging in a feud completely evaporated. Nancy didn't just want me gone. She was actively trying to destroy my daughter's psychological safety to satisfy her own bigotry. I realized that ignoring a bully doesn't make them disappear. It only emboldens them to find sharper weapons. Nancy needed to be stopped, and she needed to learn that actions have catastrophic consequences. I did my research. It turned out Nancy was a moderately successful real estate agent, and the neighborhood gossip mill revealed she had recently landed the absolute crown jewel of her career, an exclusive listing on a massive $2 million luxury estate just outside our subdivision. She was hosting a highly publicized open house that coming Sunday, banking her entire professional reputation on courting wealthy, elite buyers. I didn't plan an act of violence. I didn't plan to vandalize the property. I planned a mirror. I spent Friday evening making phone calls to the incredible, diverse community of friends I had left behind in our old city. I called my brother-in-law, Terrell, a brilliant black architect, and his wife Amy, a white pediatrician, and asked them to bring their beautifully chaotic mixed-race children. I called Kenji, my college roommate, and his black wife Rochelle, along with their sweet, adopted white daughter. I called Louise, a dear old friend who happened to be raising incredibly pale, red-headed twin boys. I explained the situation, and without a moment of hesitation, they all agreed to spend their Sunday afternoon touring a mansion. We didn't arrive as a mob. We staggered our entrances perfectly. When I walked through the massive double doors of the estate, the foyer was echoing with classical music and the polite murmurs of wealthy couples sipping sparkling water. Nancy was standing near the grand sweeping staircase, looking like a picture of corporate perfection in a tailored blazer. Then, Terrell and Amy walked in. I watched from the corner of the room as Nancy's professional smile faltered, her eyes immediately tracking the loud, joyful entrance of their mixed family. 10 minutes later, Kenji and Rochelle arrived, holding their adopted daughter's hands. Then came Louise with his boys. Every time one of my friends approached Nancy to ask perfectly polite questions about the property's square footage or the property taxes, her discomfort radiated off her in waves. She couldn't help herself. Her bias was so deeply ingrained, so fundamentally tied to her worldview, that she simply couldn't bite her tongue. Standing near the kitchen island, pretending to admire the marble countertops, I watched the trap snap shut. Kenji struck up a conversation with Nancy, his phone casually resting in his breast pocket, the camera lens perfectly exposed and recording. Nancy, trying to project an air of helpful confidentiality, leaned in and softly warned Kenji that the neighborhood wasn't very diverse, and that his little white daughter might feel deeply isolated among the residents. Minutes later, she cornered Louise near the French doors, suggesting with a condescendingly sweet tone that his pale boys would probably be much happier in a more urban school district where they would blend in better. She told Terrell that some of the more traditional neighbors might have unspoken issues with mixed-race families moving into the community. She was literally violating federal fair housing laws, on camera, entirely of her own free will. But the absolute masterpiece of the afternoon happened just as the open house was winding down. The owner of the mansion arrived. Mr. Van Hutchinson was a titan of local industry, a man whose wealth was only matched by his quiet, commanding dignity, and he was a black man. Nancy had absolutely no idea. She had secured the listing through his wife, Janet, who was white and handled all of the family's estate matters in person while he traveled for business. When Mr. Van Hutchinson stepped through the front doors, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, Nancy practically sprinted over to greet him, assuming he was just another wealthy prospective buyer. When he extended a large hand and introduced himself as the owner of the property, all the blood instantly drained from Nancy's face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning, her flawless professional mask shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, unfiltered panic. Mr. Van Hutchinson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He possessed the kind of quiet authority that makes a room stand still. He gestured for Nancy to follow him away from the lingering guests, but sound carries beautifully in spaces with vaulted ceilings and hardwood floors. I stood by the entryway, watching as Mr. Van Hutchinson quietly dismantled her. He casually mentioned that he had been standing in the adjacent sunroom for the past 20 minutes. He had heard her deeply concerning remarks regarding the neighborhood fit and her unprompted warnings about diversity. Nancy's face flushed a violent, mottled crimson. She started backpedaling frantically, her hands fluttering in the air as she stammered out pathetic excuses about context, about being misunderstood, about merely trying to ensure buyers found the perfect cultural fit. Her voice grew shrill. The remaining guests in the house, catching the undeniable scent of a scandal, began putting down their Perrier glasses and shuffling quietly out the front doors, averting their eyes. Within minutes, the grand mansion was entirely empty, save for me, Nancy, and Mr. Van Hutchinson. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Kenji, Just 3 words. Got it all. Attached was a crystal-clear video file. I tapped play, the audio muted, watching Nancy's undeniable, overt discrimination play out in high definition. It was the silver bullet. This wasn't my word against hers anymore. This was a licensed real estate agent breaking the law, caught in 4K resolution. Mr. Van Hutchinson walked over to where I was standing. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek, but his voice was remarkably steady. He asked for my contact information, typing my number into his phone with deliberate, forceful taps. He turned his head slightly, casting a look of utter disgust toward Nancy, who was now frozen at the base of the staircase, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. He told her, in a tone that brokered zero argument, that they would be having an immediate, severe conversation regarding the termination of her contract, and then he walked out the door. I followed him out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the heat of Nancy's hateful, terrified stare boring into my shoulder blades. The 20-minute drive back to my house felt like a blur of adrenaline and vindication. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. A fierce, intoxicating satisfaction roared in my ears, but beneath it lay a cold, creeping dread. I had just detonated a bomb in the center of Nancy's life. She would know I was the architect of her destruction. She would know those specific families hadn't just wandered in by accident. Lily was safely across town at Zoe's house for a sleepover, which was a profound relief. Whatever fallout was coming, my daughter wouldn't have to witness it. I pulled into my driveway, cut the engine, and just sat in the heavy silence of the car. I had ruined her biggest sale. I had potentially destroyed her career. A small, nagging voice of guilt tried to surface, asking if I had gone too far, if I was becoming just as vindictive as she was. But then I remembered Lily. I remembered her sitting in that plastic chair in the school hallway, her small body shaking, asking why the lady wanted to take her away from her daddy. The memory of my daughter's tears incinerated my guilt. Nancy deserved every single ounce of the ruin coming her way. That evening, as I was chewing mechanically on a slice of leftover pizza, my phone lit up with Mr. Van Hutchinson's name. He sounded exhausted. He formally thanked me for exposing Nancy's true character before he paid her a massive commission. He confirmed he was terminating her representation immediately, pulling the listing, and more importantly, he was filing a formal discrimination complaint with the State Real Estate Licensing Board first thing Monday morning. When I hung up the phone, the reality of the situation settled over me like a lead weight. I had won the battle, but Nancy lived exactly 2 houses down from me. I had to share a street, a sidewalk, and a neighborhood with a woman who now had absolutely nothing left to lose. The retaliation came at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. I was standing at the stove, flipping a pancake, when a blur of motion outside the kitchen window caught my eye. Nancy was charging up my driveway like a guided missile. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of absolute fury. Her phone clutched so tightly in her fist, I thought the screen might crack. I killed the burner, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the front door firmly shut behind me. I absolutely refused to let her cross my threshold, and I was determined not to give her an audience for her hysterics. She hit the bottom step of the porch, panting heavily, her chest heaving. She didn't bother with a greeting. She launched into a screaming, venomous tirade, her voice cracking with rage. She accused me of actively sabotaging her livelihood, of organizing a malicious conspiracy to ruin her life. She screamed that she had already contacted her attorney and was going to sue me into absolute bankruptcy for tortious interference. Every word was designed to intimidate, to bully me back into submission. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned casually against the wooden railing of the porch, crossing my arms over my chest, letting the silence stretch for a beat after she finished screaming. I looked her dead in the eye and calmly pointed out that I hadn't forced her to do a single thing. I had merely invited a few friends to a publicly advertised open house. I didn't script the racist poison that fell out of her mouth. I didn't force her to discriminate against paying clients. She made those choices entirely on her own, in broad daylight, and now she was simply choking on the consequences of her own bigotry. As the reality of my words hit her, the manic rage on Nancy's face began to fracture. The anger melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, ugly desperation. Actual tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her mascara, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. Her voice dropped to a shaky, trembling whisper. She sobbed that I had ruined her life over a few tiny misunderstandings, insisting with a nauseating victimhood that she was only ever trying to protect the integrity of the neighborhood and keep everyone safe. Hearing her invoke the concept of safety made my blood run cold. I pushed off the railing and stepped to the very edge of the stairs, looming over her. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. I told her that calling armed police officers on a grieving father 4 times wasn't protecting anyone. I told her that calling Child Protective Services and having a traumatized 7-year-old girl pulled out of her classroom wasn't keeping anyone safe. It was racial terrorism. It was pure, unadulterated evil. And for the first time in her miserable life, she was finally being held accountable for it. Nancy's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no words came out. She turned her back and stumbled down the driveway, her shoulders trembling with heavy sobs. The gossip spread through the subdivision faster than a wildfire. By Tuesday, the neighborhood had fractured into invisible, tense factions. Margaret, the sweet older woman from directly across the street, ambled over with a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies, whispering conspiratorially that she was thrilled someone finally had the spine to stand up to Nancy's tyrannical behavior. 2 other neighbors flagged me down near the mailboxes, offering sheepish, belated apologies, admitting they had watched Nancy stalk my daughter for months and felt ashamed for looking the other way. But it wasn't all cookies and solidarity. The couple 3 doors down began glaring at me openly when I mowed the lawn. The man I usually swapped small talk with at the bus stop suddenly found his shoes incredibly interesting whenever I approached. The air on our street felt thick, charged with an ugly, unspoken tension. The collateral damage hit Lily on a Wednesday. She walked through the front door after school, her small shoulders slumped, dragging her Elsa backpack across the floor. Her eyes were bloodshot. She pulled a crumpled permission slip from her pocket and handed it to me without looking up. In a voice so small it shattered my heart, she whispered that a boy in her class told her that his mommy said their family wasn't allowed to play with Lily anymore. His mommy had said we were troublemakers who ruined people's lives. Lily looked up at me, her lower lip quivering, and asked the question that would haunt me for months. "Daddy, are we bad people? Did we do something wrong?" I pulled her onto the living room sofa, wrapping my arms around her tiny frame, resting my chin on the top of her head. I tried to explain, using words soft enough for a child to understand, but heavy enough to hold the truth, that doing the right thing and standing up for yourself sometimes makes other people very angry and very uncomfortable. I told her we were good people fighting a hard battle, but the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I had orchestrated Nancy's professional ruin to protect my daughter, but the social radioactive fallout was raining down directly on Lily's head. I hadn't planned for that. That night, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Terrell. He had screenshots. Nancy had taken to the private neighborhood Facebook groups, weaving a masterful, tear-jerking narrative of victimhood. She didn't name me directly. Of course, she was too legally savvy for that. But she posted agonizing paragraphs about being targeted, harassed, and intimidated by aggressive new residents. She painted herself as a frightened, vulnerable woman living in terror in her own home, and people were buying it. Neighbors who had no idea about the police calls or the CPS investigation were flooding the comments with sympathy, offering prayers and support, validating her delusions. Terrell urged me to post a rebuttal, to expose her, but I was exhausted. I decided to starve her of oxygen and ignore the digital circus. 3 days later, Mr. Van Hutchinson called again. He bypassed the pleasantries and asked if I would be willing to draft a comprehensive, sworn written statement for the State Real Estate Licensing Board. He wanted every single incident of Nancy's harassment documented, creating an undeniable, ironclad paper trail of her discriminatory behavior. I didn't hesitate. After I put Lily to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of black coffee, and I wrote. I wrote about the dog incident. I wrote about the surveillance photography. I wrote about Zoe's mother, I listed the dates and times of all 5 police visits. I wrote about the CPS interrogation, my pen digging so hard into the paper it nearly tore the page. Seeing it all compiled in one stark, chronological document was horrifying. It made me physically nauseous to realize the sheer volume of trauma this woman had inflicted on us in such a short amount of time. I scanned the document and emailed it to Mr. Van Hutchinson's attorney the following morning. I hoped it was the final nail in the coffin. But trauma doesn't just evaporate because you file paperwork. That weekend, Lily was a ghost in her own home. She sat in the middle of the living room rug, listlessly moving a plastic horse back and forth, completely detached. I asked if she wanted to walk down to the park to use the swings. She just shrugged, staring blankly at the wall. Finally, she turned to me, her blue eyes dark with a profound, premature sorrow, and asked if we were going to have to pack up our boxes and move away again because the people here hated us. The question hit me with the kinetic force of a freight train. It hurt infinitely more than Nancy screaming on my porch. I sat on the floor next to her, pulling her onto my lap. How do you explain the insidious, rotting nature of systemic racism to a child who just wants to ride her bicycle on the sidewalk? I stroked her hair and told her the truth. I told her that some people let fear and ignorance put poison in their brains, and they hate people simply because their skin looks different. Lily looked at her pale arm, and then at my dark hand resting against it. Does she hate us because we don't match, Daddy? I swallowed the lump of glass in my throat and whispered, "Yes, baby, that's exactly why." She rested her head against my chest, carrying a burden she was far too young to hold. I promised her we wouldn't run. I promised her this was our home, but I could see the light in her eyes dimming, the innocent belief in a safe world slipping away. On Monday, the other shoe dropped. A woman claiming to be an HR representative from Nancy's real estate brokerage called me. She sounded tense and hyper-professional. She officially informed me that Nancy had been placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending an exhaustive internal investigation into severe allegations of discrimination and misconduct. She asked if I possessed any additional evidence. I coldly informed her that the state licensing board had my sworn affidavit, and she could direct her inquiries there. When I hung up, a dark, vindictive thrill shot through my veins. Nancy was drowning, but when I walked to the front window and stared at her house, just 2 lawns away, the thrill soured into deep anxiety. I was in a trench war with an unstable woman who lived 50 yards from where my daughter slept. The battle lines shifted constantly. Zoe's mom called me that evening, practically in tears, stumbling over a breathless apology. She confessed that another parent in the neighborhood had cornered her, spinning a wild story about how I had orchestrated a vicious, unprovoked ambush to destroy Nancy. Zoe's mom had started to doubt me, wondering if I was the aggressor. So, I laid it all out. I gave her the exact timeline. I told her about the police, the flashing lights, the birth certificate. I told her about the CPS worker pulling Lily from reading time. By the time I finished, Zoe's mom was crying. She was horrified that she had ever questioned my integrity, sickened that she had given Nancy's victim routine an ounce of credibility. She promised to ensure her daughter Zoe knew that Lily was safe, good, and loved. It was a small victory, but it felt like grabbing a life preserver in a storm. 2 nights later, the doorbell rang. I opened it cautiously to find a man in jeans and a baseball cap standing on my porch. It took me a second to recognize him. It was one of the patrol officers who had responded to Nancy's 4th false kidnapping call. He held up his hands peacefully, explaining he was off duty and visiting as a private citizen. He looked me in the eye and told me he had just submitted his own official statement to the real estate board, thoroughly documenting Nancy's hysterical, entirely fabricated emergency. He told me he had worn a badge for 15 years, and he was sick and tired of watching wealthy, prejudiced people weaponize the 911 dispatch system as a personal hit squad against black families. He shook my hand, his grip firm and validating, and told me he hoped they pulled her license permanently. Watching his taillights fade down the street, I actually let myself believe that the universe was finally tilting toward justice. That naive hope survived exactly 14 days. It died the moment I signed for a thick, certified envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. I ripped it open standing in the kitchen, my stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss as my eyes scanned the heavy legal bond paper. It was a formal demand letter from Nancy's high-priced attorney. She was threatening to file a massive civil lawsuit against me for defamation, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and tortious interference with business contracts. The letter spun a fantastical, twisted narrative, accusing me of stalking her, of organizing a targeted mob to humiliate her at her place of employment, and of maliciously orchestrating her termination. The final paragraph demanded a cashier's check for $50,000 punitive damages and a legally binding public apology within 10 days, or they would see me in court. I read the document 3 times, my vision blurring with rage. This woman had terrorized my child, weaponized the police against me, and lost her job because of her own recorded bigotry, and now she was demanding $50,000 from me. I immediately dialed Jessica, a fierce, brilliant friend from law school, who now ran a successful family and civil litigation practice. I emailed her a PDF of the letter. She called me back in less than an hour, her tone sharp and pragmatic. Jessica dismissed the demand for money as a pathetic intimidation tactic, a desperate bluff to force me into backing down. But she warned me that Nancy was cornered, and cornered animals bite hard. She offered to represent me formally, slashing her retainer fee out of loyalty, and ordered me to immediately assemble a war room of evidence. I spent the next 6 hours scanning police reports, printing witness testimonies from Margaret and Zoe's mom, and securing the raw video file from Kenji. I was preparing for a bloodbath, but the war was exacting a terrible price. That night, Lily woke up screaming. It was a raw, primal shriek that tore me from a dead sleep. I sprinted down the hallway, bursting into her bedroom to find her tangled in her sheets, hyperventilating, drenched in cold sweat. I scooped her up, rocking her back and forth, murmuring promises into her hair. Between jagged, gasping sobs, she kept repeating that the strangers were coming back, that the lady with the clipboard was going to put her in a car and drive her away from me. The CPS investigation hadn't just scared her, it had fundamentally broken her sense of security. The ongoing, simmering tension with Nancy was acting as a continuous psychological trigger. The next morning, I called the pediatric trauma therapist the school had recommended. I begged for an emergency slot. They had a cancellation and fit us in the very next day. I realized then that winning a lawsuit meant absolutely nothing if my daughter's mind was a casualty of the war. 3 days after the demand letter, the conflict escalated from a civil threat to a physical restriction. I answered the door to find a bored-looking process server who slapped a thick manila folder against my chest. Nancy had filed a petition for a temporary restraining order against me. The paperwork was a masterclass in fiction. Under penalty of perjury, she swore that I was a dangerous, aggressive stalker. She cited my friends attending the open house as proof of a coordinated campaign of intimidation, claiming she was living in a state of constant, paralyzing fear that I would escalate my vendetta into physical violence against her. A hearing was set at the county courthouse in 3 weeks. Standing in the foyer, holding the petition, a cold, calculated calm washed over me. Nancy wanted to use the justice system to brand me as a violent black aggressor. I called Jessica. We spent the entire next day in her downtown office, drafting a devastating counter-petition. We attached the 5 police reports, the CPS clearance documents, the neighbor statements, and a transcript of the open house recording. Jessica looked across her desk at me, her eyes hard, and promised we were going to obliterate Nancy's narrative in front of a judge. The 3 weeks leading up to the court date were a suffocating purgatory. The neighborhood had completely polarized. I couldn't walk to the mailbox without feeling the invisible weight of eyes judging me from behind drawn curtains. Margaret brought more cookies. The man 3 doors down waved with aggressive enthusiasm, but others turned their backs when I drove past. It was maddening. But the true heartbreak came from Lily's teacher. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice thick with concern. Lily had entirely withdrawn. She was refusing to participate in reading circles. She was sitting alone against the chain-link fence during recess. And that morning, she had gotten into a shoving match with another little girl. The teacher had intervened before anyone was hurt, but Lily had spent the rest of the day looking utterly hollowed out. Hanging up the phone, a wave of profound guilt crashed over me. I had been so fiercely focused on building a legal fortress, on proving my own righteousness, on defeating Nancy, that I had lost sight of the battlefield. My daughter was suffocating in the smoke. I had moved her to this suburb to heal from the devastating loss of her mother, to give her a childhood bathed in sunlight and safety. Instead, my relentless pursuit of justice had dragged her into a vicious, neighborhood-wide Cold War. She was losing her friends. She was carrying the crushing weight of a conflict she couldn't understand. I was prioritizing my pride over her peace. The morning of the restraining order hearing, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. The county courthouse smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. I sat at a heavy wooden table next to Jessica, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Nancy sat 10 feet away, flanked by a slick, expensive-looking attorney. She refused to look at me. When she took the witness stand, she delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She trembled perfectly. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. She described the open house as a terrifying, coordinated ambush designed to publicly humiliate her and destroy her ability to feed herself. She painted me as a menacing, vindictive shadow looming over her life, insisting she couldn't sleep because she knew I lived just 2 doors down, plotting my next attack. Her lawyer leaned heavily on the trope of the aggressive, unpredictable man, implying I was a ticking time bomb. Then it was Jessica's turn. She didn't employ theatrics. She wielded facts like a scalpel. She systematically entered every piece of evidence into the official record. The judge, an older, stern-faced man, read through the 5 police reports of false kidnapping claims. He reviewed the CPS documentation. He read the sworn statements from Zoe's mom and Margaret. And then, Jessica played the video from Kenji's phone. The audio echoed through the small courtroom. Nancy's own voice, dripping with casual racism, talking about urban districts and mixed families, and a lack of diversity. Jessica masterfully pointed out that Nancy's comments weren't coerced. They weren't a reaction to harassment. They were Nancy revealing her fundamental character to prospective buyers. The judge's demeanor shifted entirely. The sympathetic gaze he had previously directed at Nancy hardened into a look of absolute, icy skepticism. He saw exactly what she was. It took the judge less than 5 minutes to rule. He denied Nancy's petition for a restraining order with extreme prejudice. He stared her down from the bench and stated, for the official record, that the evidence demonstrated a severe, unprovoked pattern of racial harassment initiated by Nancy against my family. He clarified that attending a public real estate event is not stalking. But then his gaze swept over both of us, and he issued a stern, exasperated warning. He told us that this escalating war was destroying our neighborhood and deeply harming the children involved. He ordered us to stay away from each other and strongly suggested mediation. Case dismissed. I walked out of the double doors feeling a massive wave of relief, but it was instantly undercut by exhaustion. In the parking lot, the humid air clung to my skin. I glanced back and saw Nancy standing near her luxury sedan. She was staring at me, and the look on her face wasn't defeat. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. She had lost her job, her reputation, and her court case. But the fire in her eyes told me she was willing to burn the entire neighborhood to the ground, if it meant taking me with her. This wasn't over. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel, realizing I had won the legal battle, but was entirely losing the war for my family's peace. That reality materialized the moment I walked through my front door. It was 6:00 p.m. The house was silent, save for the sound of muffled, wretched weeping coming from down the hall. I found Lily curled into a tight ball on her bed, her face buried in her pillow. I sat on the edge of the mattress, gently rubbing her back until she sat up. Her eyes were swollen, her breath hitching. She confessed that she had eavesdropped on a phone call I had with Jessica earlier that week. She knew about the court case. She knew the lady hated us. She looked at me, her small face crumpled in agony, and asked why we couldn't just move back to the city where nobody cared what color anyone was. And then, she asked the question that finally broke my resolve. She asked if it was her fault, She asked if Nancy hated us because Lily had blonde hair and I didn't. She thought her very existence, her appearance, was the cause of all this misery. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. I pulled her to my chest, kissing the top of her head, swearing to her that Nancy's sickness was her own, that Lily was perfect, that none of this was her fault. But she just buried her face in my shirt and cried. The next morning, I sat in the muted, pastel waiting room of Lily's therapist. When the session was almost over, the therapist called me into the back office. She closed the door, folded her hands on her lap, and looked at me with deep compassion. She told me the hard truth. She said that while I was absolutely justified in fighting back against a racist aggressor, the ongoing conflict was actively traumatizing my daughter. The anxiety was compounding. The nightmares were a manifestation of a total loss of safety. Lily was internalizing the adult warfare, blaming her own physical identity for the chaos. The therapist looked me in the eye and said, "Sometimes, protecting your child means surrendering a fight you have every right to win. She needs peace more than she needs you to conquer your neighbor." I drove home in a daze, defensive and deeply ashamed. I wanted to teach my daughter to never back down from prejudice. But I thought about my late wife. I could almost hear her voice, gentle but firm, telling me to pick my battles, to never let my pride cost our family its soul. I was fighting for justice, but the price of admission was Lily's childhood. 3 days later, Margaret knocked on my door. Her eyes were wide with neighborhood gossip. Nancy's brokerage had officially concluded their investigation. They had fired her. They cited severe violations of fair housing laws and unacceptable corporate liability. The news should have tasted like sweet victory. Instead, it tasted like ash. Nancy was now unemployed, disgraced, and desperate people are incredibly dangerous. My fear was validated less than 48 hours later. I walked out into the driveway on a crisp Tuesday morning, holding Lily's hand, ready to take her to school. I stopped dead. The entire driver's side of my sedan had been keyed. A jagged, deep scratch ran from the taillight all the way to the front fender. But it was the hood that made my blood freeze. Scratched deep into the paint, exposing the silver metal beneath, was a horrific, violent racial slur. The letters were massive. I tried to shield Lily's eyes, but I was too late. She looked at the ugly, jagged letters, her face draining of color, and asked what the word meant. I quickly ushered her back inside the house, locking the deadbolt, my hands shaking with a terrifying, violent rage. I called the police. An officer took photos, filed a report, and told me bluntly that without security footage, it was a dead end. I told him about Nancy's firing. He noted it, but said suspicion wasn't proof. The vandalism broke something fundamental in Lily. When I dropped her off at school late, she clung to my leg, asking repeatedly if the bad people were going to come into our house. That night, she refused to sleep in her room. She came into my bedroom, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with sheer terror, and begged me to take her to Aunt Amy's house. She told me she didn't want to live here anymore. She didn't feel safe, standing there, looking at my terrified child. I realized the war was over. I had to surrender. I called Terrell and Amy, and we packed a bag. We fled our own home in the middle of the night. I spent the next afternoon working remotely from the echoing silence of my house, while Lily played safely across town with her cousins. At 3:00 p.m., a knock startled me. It was a neighbor from across the street, a quiet woman I barely knew. She stood awkwardly on my porch, shifting her weight. She told me she had heard about the car and about Nancy losing her job. She hesitated, wringing her hands, and then she told me the rest of Nancy's story. She explained that 3 years ago, Nancy's husband had been mowing the front lawn. He had suffered a massive, catastrophic heart attack. He collapsed on the grass and died instantly. The neighbor explained that before his death, Nancy had been a bit uptight, but generally normal. After he died, something inside her snapped. The sudden, violent lack of control over her life mutated into a frantic, obsessive need to control everything around her. She became hypervigilant, paranoid, reporting neighbors for leaving trash cans out, policing the boundaries of the neighborhood as if it could keep death at bay. The grief had rotted into bigotry and paranoia. I closed the door and slid down the wall, sitting on the hardwood floor of the foyer. I didn't want to know that. I wanted Nancy to be a one-dimensional monster. But hearing about her husband, about the sudden, world-ending grief, held up a terrifying mirror. I had lost my wife to cancer. I had moved my daughter to this suburb in a desperate attempt to control our environment, to force the world to be safe and predictable. Nancy and I were both drowning in grief. My grief made me fiercely protective. Her grief had metastasized into a paranoid, racist crusade against the unknown. It didn't excuse a single thing she had done. Her actions were abhorrent and unforgivable, but it suddenly made her horribly, tragically human. The next day, Jessica called. Nancy's lawyer had reached out with a settlement offer. Nancy would permanently drop all pending and future civil litigation if I agreed to a mutual ceasefire. No more police, no more courts, no more contact. We both walk away. Jessica advised me to take. The real estate board was still investigating Nancy independently, so justice was still being served, but the personal war would end. I drove over to Terrell and Amy's house that evening. Sitting at their kitchen table, looking out the window at Lily laughing with her cousins in the backyard, I asked Terrell what my wife would do. Amy reached across the table and covered my hand. She told me that I had already won. Nancy had faced massive consequences, but if I kept fighting for revenge, the collateral damage would be my daughter's soul. I knew they were right. It felt like swallowing ground glass to let Nancy walk away, but I was a father before I was a warrior. I called Jessica and told her to draft the settlement. The healing was slow, awkward, and profoundly complicated. Lily's therapist explained that accepting the settlement was the greatest gift I could have given my daughter. It provided immediate stability. But Lily still harbored the guilt, still believed her appearance was the catalyst. It wasn't until Nancy's house went up for sale a month later that things truly began to shift. I ran into Nancy one final time before she moved. It was a Tuesday morning at the grocery store. I turned down the cereal aisle, pushing my cart, and there she was. We locked eyes over a display of granola. The air in the aisle froze. For 10 agonizing seconds, the woman who had tried to destroy my life and the man who had derailed her career just stared at each other. The anger was gone, replaced by a heavy, hollow exhaustion. I gave her a single, curt nod, an acknowledgement of our shared survival, nothing more. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She nodded back, turned her cart, and walked away forever. The true closure came unexpectedly. A week before the moving trucks arrived at Nancy's house, her adult daughter showed up on my porch. She looked exhausted. She offered a profound, unreserved apology for her mother's horrific actions. She confirmed the PTSD diagnosis stemming from her father's death, explaining that Nancy was finally in intensive psychiatric therapy, beginning to unpack the racist paranoia her grief had birthed. The daughter asked, hesitantly, if Nancy could offer a supervised apology to Lily. Every protective instinct I had screamed no. But Lily's therapist shocked me by endorsing the idea, explaining that hearing the woman take full accountability could sever the guilt Lily was carrying. The session took place in the therapist's office. Nancy looked small, fragile, stripped of her suburban armor. She sat across from my 7-year-old daughter, weeping real tears, and took absolute responsibility. She told Lily that her behavior was cruel, wrong, and entirely born of her own sickness. She explicitly stated that Lily was beautiful, perfect, and completely innocent. I watched my daughter's shoulders drop, a physical weight lifting from her small frame. Lily looked at the woman who had terrorized her, her blue eyes clear and steady. With an incredible, breathtaking grace, Lily said, "I forgive you, but I don't want to be your friend." Nancy nodded, sobbing quietly, and left. The transformation in my daughter was miraculous. The nightmares vanished. She started singing in the kitchen again. The neighborhood, purged of the toxic surveillance, blossomed into the community we had dreamed of. A wonderful, diverse young couple named Jasmine and Chris bought Nancy's house, moving in with a beautiful baby girl. The street felt lighter. We had block parties where everyone, black, white, mixed, adopted, mingled without a shadow of suspicion. 6 months after the nightmare began, I was kneeling in the dirt of our front garden, the afternoon sun warming my back. Lily was beside me, her hands covered in soil, carefully planting bright purple and yellow flowers, her mother's favorites. She was laughing, telling me about a new friend she made down the street. I looked around our neighborhood. The trauma was a scar now, fading a little more every day. We hadn't run away. We hadn't let bigotry force us out of our home. I had fought the monster, and when the battle threatened to consume my child, I had found the strength to put down the sword. Watching Lily pat the soil around a sunflower seedling, perfectly at peace, I knew we were finally, truly home.